From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress, and I'm thrilled to welcome you here tonight on an unseasonably cold and a wet day for the last evening event of our spring season here at the library, the Pacific Islander Literary Spotlight, featuring Brandy Nalani McDougall, Craig Santos Perez, and Liz Soto. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our presenting partners, Ala Press, who is presenting for the first time with us here for this event, and some other presenting partners we've worked with before, most notably on our Asian American literary series, the Asian American Literary Review, the Asian American Studies Program at the University of Maryland, Poets and Writers, and the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. I would especially like to thank Lawrence Bowie Min Davis for helping organize this event with one of our featured poets, Craig Santos Perez. It's been fun to talk about this and to end the literary season here on a high note with poets we've brought from very, very, very far away, or who have come from very, very far away to speak with us, read for us tonight. Before we begin, please turn off any cell phones and electronic devices you have that might interfere with the recording of the event. Also, please note that this program is being videotaped for webcast on the Library of Congress's website, and by participating in the event, you give the library permission for future use of the recordings. Let me also tell you a little bit about the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress. We are home to the U.S. Poet Laureate. We will have a new U.S. Poet Laureate as of next week, so be sure to look to the news to see. We put on literary recordings, readings, and panels of all sorts throughout the year. If you'd like to find out more about events like this, I think we only have one or two more events until the fall. You can sign our sign-up sheet, which is outside, and we'll send you emails. You can also check out our website, www.loc.gov/poetry. And now on to tonight's event. You can read about our featured poets in your print program. They will read in alphabetical order here on stage for 10 minutes apiece, and then they will have a moderated discussion with Lawrence. We will also save time at the end for you to ask questions. We have a cordless mic. We'll hand it around. We just want to make sure when you do that Q&A that you wait until we give you the mic so we can make sure to get the question recorded for the webcast. Finally, let me tell you a little bit about our moderator. Lawrence is the founding director and current co-editor-in-chief of the Asian American Literary Review and is overseeing development of its global digital education project, the Mixed Race Initiative. He is also a consultant with the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. Since 2005, he has taught Asian American literature, Asian American film, and mixed race studies for the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. It will be wonderful to have him up on stage a little bit later in the program, but first, please join me in welcoming Brandy Nalani McDougall, Craig Santos Perez, and Liz Soto.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to Lawrence and Rob and Matt and Craig and Brandy. Obviously, I'm not Brandy. I'm Liz. So I'm going to read from a poem tonight called American Homelands, which is essentially my poetic investigation into my cultural and racial background. There are quite a few pieces of that background, so you are only getting small pieces of me tonight. So I will begin. Thank you. American Homelands. 1. Cherokee dreams. My great-grandmother, so afraid of flashing her skin in Alabama colors, hid one half of her family at the back of a closet in a shoebox. She tucked stories in an invisible cloak. There might have been tears in a bottle. But her niece remembers only the box brimming with photographs, her aunt brimming with stories under her breath. Do not forget my memory. Listen to these pictures with me. I imagine my cousin, still young, before she let my 10-year-old self ride her favorite mare, before her hands turned to limestone and hardpan, before she helped me leap to the sky, she listened to photographs in secret behind closed doors. This is the only story I know. 2. España, goodbye. I say goodbye with a tongue thick between molars and cheek, which is perhaps clouding my vision. For you are mostly imaginary. In half-spoken family lore, you live as a conquering, red-headed Spanish giant, so I am doubtful of your reality, even if I carry your name. Learn the value of a name, the cost of a name, the weight of a name when they call my name. Soto, that once was de Soto, that once immigrated to a U.S. territory and became Soto. So you don't speak Spanish. Why? My answer in a sour twist of mouth, I am not really Hispanic. Please, ignore my face. Instead, ask me why do you not speak Tagalog, Ilocano, Irish Gaelic, Cherokee, Scottish Gaelic, French, German, or Cantonese. Ask me why is your monolith tongue squatting in English. Then I might say, come, let me tell you a story. 3. England at sea. In the 21st century, in a Whole Foods, swollen with organic privilege and fantasies of a better kind of consumption, I imagine citrus as exotic pith when I buy orange juice by the gallon for $6 US. I wonder if fresh goat cheese might be better than feta. I order a pound of sliced roasted turkey from a cornucopia encased in spotless glass in an ocean of plenty. In the 17th century, some ancestor left home and headed west across the Atlantic Sea with no falling edge in a ship that went unswallowed by monsters on a journey through mountains of water, and I wonder if courage was a name, or if hopeless filled the greatest measure and risk went undefined and relative only to death. I have read the words hardtack and scurvy with a slice of orange between my lips. I guess this ancestor, an acquaintance of poverty, looked with fascination held in back teeth at this world's closed eyes, turning away the poor, tired, huddled masses, never knowing the word free. 4. Deutschland, Frances, chop suey. Always caught in a middle bit of this, bit of that. I remember great-grandma Mimi speaking German with a French accent, remnants of Alsace-Lorraine's tangled roots. I remember this story. Cousin Linda practiced German with her grandmother. When she went to school, her teacher told her to stop. She should not speak French-infused German, and yes, there is a wrong way for your grandmother to speak her native tongue. 6. Remember the Philippines, Grandpa. I don't. But sometimes I think I see pictures haunting an oil-slick surface of random puddles. More than 30 years later, I still find shame creeping from beneath my collar. I didn't understand most of you. Your words in brisk pigeon shuffle, halted by a stiff eardrum, unused to, unwilling to hear. I wasn't able to pause until your whole face grinned and you offered me $20 for me to stop running and face you, and I did. When I was 9, I did not have to look up to meet your eyes as you called me granddaughter. I can imagine your sparse gray hair, your dry brown skin, your thick-skinned hands, your rounded boxer's back while I read for a living. I can almost hear you ask, where are the vegetables in my garden? Where are the calluses on my hands? When will I work for a living? Grandpa, I try. I don't remember the Philippines, Grandpa, but as I peel back these stories, I remember a little bit more of you. 7, Filipino distance. You should be more familiar, cousin. We should know the scent of each other's houses. I will tell you now, my house smells of fried onion, of dish soap, of dog, of red dirt, of olive oil, of chili, and always of coffee. How is it across the way? Tell me, does your house smell of garlic or patis? Does a wind run through the louvered windows and bring frangipani, yang yang, or sampaguita in the wake of its tails? Is there always cooked rice in a pot? Do you pray to ancestors? Do you keep your ruins standing? Do you visit with arms filled with food? Do you bring ande ande or leche flan to the table? Cousin, tomorrow I would grow bitter melon and marangue in a garden once filled with rosemary and thyme. 9, colonial settlers in from Guangdong stand in pineapple cannery assembly lines. Grandma, in a cotton apron and cap with rubber-encased hands etched with juice on metal rollers and teeth filled with holes, the legacy of snacking on the job. Packing aluminum cans on conveyor belts with slices of fruit for 7 mouths that could never be filled. Genealogy is a black hole beyond Hawaii shores. Mana'o'o, Iko, Moko, Pilikia are all tied up in grandmother who could not speak of neither the sour nor the sweet. Memories stripped of enamel have acid-soaked patina running a stuck play. She is 10 years old for 70 years left in the middle of a hungry Pacific mouth by a father too tired to take his family home. Guangdong wanted him returned, and daughters must have been costly, difficult baggage. So Grandma consumed her own children in a froth of rage, since she never found a definition for mother or father or love in the satchel lump anchored to her back, and I never once asked her to unpack. Instead, I read Grace Young and the Wisdom of the Chinese Kitchen and asked strangers, how do I make juk? How do I make gao? How do I make jai? 10, diaspora homelands. Chart this body filled with 2 oceans and 100 seas. 1,000 islands nestle between winged vertebrae of this spine that sometimes cowers from flight. Map this body filled with nothing but memories of long ago feasts eaten to dust in lands far, far away. And except here, I will always be foreign. 11, descendant homeland. My dearest Jacob, aloha e ku'ukeki kane. You were carved in the first breakwaters of this Oahu shore. You have not yet made it to land. I wish I had more to give you, but these are the only stories I know. Thank you.
Okay. Aloha mai kako. I'm Brandy Nalani McDougall. This is Craig Santos Perez. We're going to kind of go back and forth with our poems. We are married and we have a child. So, you know, this kind of collaboration, I think, kind of comes easy to us in some ways. And we hope you enjoy. So we're just going to go back and forth with a few of our poems, so you'll know.
So I want to say also hafa. Thank you all for coming tonight. I want to thank Rob and Matt and Lawrence for setting up this reading. We're so excited to be here in DC and to read at the Library of Congress. It's a kind of long time dream come true. Can we get another round of applause for Liz for her incredible poetry? We've been lucky enough to work with Liz the past couple of years and be continuously inspired by her. For tonight's reading, we're going to read some published work as well as some new work. We hope you enjoy, and we're looking forward to the conversation as well. Brandy's going to read the first poem. This is from her first book called The Salt Wind. And throughout this reading, we're also going to ask for some participation. So for this poem, we're going to ask you guys to perform a little chant.
Don't worry, it's a very short chant. It's very easy to memorize. It's actually, you're going to be chanting the name of one of our ancestors, Kanaka Maoli ancestors, Haloanaka. So Haloanaka was our elder brother who became the kalo, the taro, the staple food of our people. So the way you say the chant is Haloanaka, 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 Haloanaka.
Haloanaka. Let's keep going.
Yeah, just keep going. I'll keep going.
Yeah.
Haloanaka. There is no need to sweeten your body's ripe offering to suit my open mouth. I take you in as you are, the taste of earth and light, salt winds sieved through valley rains. Just days ago, your heart-shaped leaves faced the sun, funneling light and warmth through your long, trembling stalks. You felt the soft earth open itself to your roots, whose blind strands fed the crystalline nebulae that once purpled your corn. Still, you give yourself over and over again, Ehiapo, your sacrifice made ripe in the soil's short incubation, so that we may live knowing love and ohana, our bright belonging.
Thank you.
Mahalo.
So that poem ends with the line, which I love, our ohana, our bright belonging. So in Hawaiian, ohana means family, and my wife and I, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm sure some of you might know that from Lilo and Stitch, right?
True. Yeah. So my wife and I just had our first child, who's in the back sleeping, and being a new parent has been a very kind of scary experience, very much an adventure, and I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a father, to be a parent in the 21st century, in a time of climate change, and at least in the Pacific, a time of increased militarization, increased violence around the world. And so a lot of the poems I'm writing for my next book is thinking about parenting during this time, and working on a series of poems called Understory. And this poem I'm going to share with you today was written during RIMPAC, which in Hawaii, it stands for Rim in the Pacific Exercises. It's a series of military exercises that the U.S. hosts in and around the waters of Hawaii. Excuse me. And in 2014, there were about 22 nations that came to test their weapons, and of course to also buy weapons from the U.S. And so this poem was written during RIMPAC. From Understory, I shall say, our daughter's name is Kaikainali'i, so that's who I'm referring to in this piece. When Kaikainali'i was newborn, Nalani rinses her in the sink. Atrazine poisons the water. A fat pilot whale, deafened by sonar, washes ashore Hanalei Bay. Now that Kaikainali'i is bigger, Nalani bathes her in the tub, cleans behind her ears, sings My Island Maui, written by her dad Jeff, whose ashes were scattered in Ma'alaya Harbor decades ago.
There were rainbows in a valley on the night the sun was born.
Schools of recently spawned fish, now lifeless, litter the tide lines of Nanakuli and Ma'ili, Ko'olina and Waikiki. When we first take Kaikainali'i to the beach, Nalani secures her tightly to her chest and carries her into the water. Hanum, Hanum, Hanum. DU munitions, PCBs, syntax. Nalani secures Kaikainali'i to her chest. What will the weapons, ships, aircrafts, and soldiers of 22 nations take from us? When they return to sand, I wrap them in a large towel. I introduce Kai to her grandpa Jeff, Nalani says. Is Oceania memorial or target, monument or territory, economic zone or makua? A cold, salt wind surges across the sand. Our small ohana shivers like generations of coral reef bleaching. Thank you.
This next poem I wrote for my father. My parents were married pretty young. My mom was 18, my dad was only 17. And that's when I came into this world. Little bit of a shotgun wedding, except there was no shotgun. They also got divorced pretty young too. After they were divorced, my father moved to California to be with family and tried to pick up the pieces of his life, I think, after that. So I wrote this poem kind of reflecting on that time in his life. It's called On Finding My Father's First Essay, San Joaquin Delta College, 1987. It must have been hard for him on days when the sun hit the Medi Delta, sending up what smelled like failure, rotten and man-made. Still, he drove his old rusty car down Pacific to the college, where he sat by those half his age who knew little of how they would begin, how easily beginnings turn into 1,000 dark miles of water. But they knew school, much more about it than he did, which words to use when, how to give nothing but the requirement, to hide between clauses and commas. This was his mistake of the essay called What Life Means to Me.
Quote, my shadows on the ocean's face, the frayed water behind a boat, rainbows in valleys and lays for my daughters, that they forgive me for leaving and all that I couldn't give, end quote.
Some nameless face read through it, asking for predicates, circling fragments, then went on, knowing our father's tears, yet deeming them unremarkable. I can see his hands thumbing the red marked page, searching for a glimpse of understanding and finding none. His face burning with shame for not knowing how much it would take to begin again, to go back across the water. He must have left that day thinking he had to work even harder for our love, to be a real father, responsible and clean as grammar.
Thank you. Okay, this next poem is also from the Understory series. And, thinking about the poem that Nalani just read, one of my biggest fears as a new parent is failing and not being able to protect our little daughter. So, from Understory. Kaikainali'i cries from teething. How do new parents comfort a child in pain, bullied in school, shot by a drunk APEC agent at McDonald's in Waikiki, #Justice for Colin Elderts. Nalani gently massages Kai's gums with her fingers. Count how many children killed in Gaza this hour of siege. How do parents wipe away the tear gas and blood, provide shelter from snipers, disarm occupying armies, #Free Palestine. Nalani sings the Hawaiian alphabet song to Kaikainali'i.
A, E, I, O, U, He, Ke, La, Mu, Nu, O, Pi, Me, Ve, Na, Pa, Ni, Na, O Kapiapa.
What lullabies will echo across detention centers and teething borders to soothe the thousands of children atop La Bastilla? Hashtag unaccompanied. Nalani rubs Kaikanui's back warm with coconut oil. How do we hold violence at arm's length when raising our hands up is no longer a universal sign of surrender? Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Kaikanu'i finally falls asleep in Nalani's cradling arms, skin to skin against the news. How do we explain to our daughter why the people building a 30-meter telescope atop Mauna Kea can't even see us standing here on sacred ground, fighting to breathe? Thank you.
Okay. This poem is called Second Gift. It was written for one of our most prominent Hawaiian sovereignty leaders, Haunani K. Trask, who was a kumu, a teacher of mine. One of her many pieces of scholarship, she writes, "The first gift of Western civilization was disease. The second gift of Western civilization was violence." So this poem is called The Second Gift, based on that quote. Ekahi.
I have no mercy or compassion for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. Malcolm X.
For over 4 generations, they have said we are a people with a history of violence.
Accustomed to the dark.
Cold cell.
Remedial in mind and body.
They write of how we killed infants.
Sacrificed humans.
Practiced incest.
How our kings and queens were alcoholic.
Inept dictators.
How we owned slaves.
How disease comes with darkness.
How they must save us from ourselves.
And we take the new tongue and its historical revisions.
The low test scores.
The longer sentences.
The water shortages.
The paid-off politicians.
The third part-time job.
The cancers and the radiation.
Diabetes and the amputations.
Eminent domain and adverse possession.
The overruling of all our objections.
Because now their violence is all we know. Elua.
We are not Americans. We are not Americans. We are not Americans. Haunani K. Trask.
Violence is more than lodging bullets into brown or black bodies.
But also burning sacred valleys.
Stabbing tunnels into mountains.
Damming streams.
Building telescopes on mountains. Dumping poisons into oceans.
Overdeveloping Aina.
Bombing and buying islands.
Violence is Arizona jail cells.
GMOs.
An on-earth Eevee waiting under a Walmart ramp.
In boxes, in museums.
In a church basement.
Violence is what we settle for because we've been led to believe green paper can feed us more than green land. Violence is what we're used to as they measure our blood to wait decades for $1 a year lease.
When we forget how we once fed and healed ourselves.
How our mouths hold life and death.
We are no longer shocked by raids on what is left in the pitched tents and tarps.
Our evictions from beach to beach and park to park.
The poverty of unfurling fists open only to the smallest of handouts.
Violence is believing you are in the United States, driving on a highway built over the sacred.
Carrying artillery to scorch the sacred so more sacred lands can become the United States through violence.
Ekolu.
Don't let anybody tell you you have no right to be angry. We have every right to be angry. This is our country. Haunani K. Trask.
You were born into captivity.
A native in a racist, anti-native world.
Yet they call you racist.
They hate you like they have hated every warrior before you.
This helps them bear the weight of dominion.
Helps them keep their vacation houses.
Golf courses.
Hotels.
And bases.
Helps them feed their children denial.
So as adults, they too can say,
don't blame me for what happened 100 years ago.
They must keep believing that the United States is our country, and not just the country that occupies our country, Hawaii. Eha.
It always seems impossible until it's done. Nelson Mandela.
You tell us you are not a racist because you fight racism. You are a warrior, and you train more warriors.
Show us how to sharpen and land words like spears.
How to catch their spears and hurl them back.
You call us the spears of our nation. Assure us decolonization is all around us.
You guide us to the rope of resistance so we can weave the newest strands together under a sovereign sun.
And so we tell our children.
Our children tell their children.
And their children tell their children.
Until our words become the chattering winds of hope that erode the hardness of darkness from the earth, and we are sown back into and born from Papa Hano Moku, green and tender once again.
Thank you. So we have one last poem to share with you today. It's from my book that came out last year, 2014. I believe it's on sale in the back, no refunds. Now, the last poem that Brandy read, Second Gift, the first gift was disease, second gift violence. The third gift, I would argue, from Western civilization is spam. This is my personal favorite food. I have a couple of food poems in this book, so we just wanted to share this one. We're going to also need your participation, and since this is the last poem of the day, we're going to ask everyone to stand up, please, if you can. Now, this is kind of a get down, have a good time. We're all like together around the table, about to feast on a little bit of spam cuisine. The poem is called Spam's Carbon Footprint. And the poem is very musical, so I want you to kind of feel free to let your body move, the way your clogged arteries kind of fill the poem, yeah? So get down with the get down, and Brandy's gonna set us off with a nice rhythm, and so you could also follow her beautiful voice and her rhythm too, yeah?
Yeah, some of you might know this song actually, or a different version of it anyway.
Yeah, that's another version. So we want to thank all of you again for joining us tonight, and we look forward to your questions.
Yeah.
Spam's Carbon Footprint.
Ooh, baby, here I am. Come rub upon my belly like spam jelly.
You can move around the halls too.
Here
There you
I
go.
am. Come rub upon my belly like spam jelly. Spam, spam jelly. Spam, spam jelly. Spam, spam jelly. Spam, spam jelly.
This is the Washington, D.C. remix! Drop a beat. Guam is considered the spam capital of the world. On average, each Chamorro consumes 16 cans of spam each year, which is more per capita than any other country. Spam is also popular in Hawaii, the Philippines, Okinawa, South Korea, Native American reservations, and anywhere with a history of U.S. military presence. Some historians argue that spam is responsible for Hitler's defeat. The Allies would have starved without spam, plus it's processed, so I guess we can save it for the coming war between the US and China, and or North Korea, and or ISIS, and or Syria, and or Iran, and or black people, and or poor people, and or students. You can take the entire block of spam along with the accompanying delicious gelatinous goo and rub it onto your wood furniture. The jelly from the spam gives it a nice luster, plus you have enough left over to use as your own personal lubricant. Maybe the economic downturn will help people truly appreciate spam instead of loathing it. Spam doesn't have to be unhealthy. I eat spam every day and I'm not dead. Just wish the spam lights. The name itself stands for Specially Processed Army Meat, Salted Pork and More. Super Pink Artificial Meal. Snake, possum, and mongoose. Or some politicians are missing. All I want for Christmas is a snow globe featuring a can of Spam sitting on an island. Turn it over and a typhoon swirls madly, unable to unseat Spam from its place of honor. During Thanksgiving, my uncle made a Spam replica of the Lincoln Memorial. Toasted crispy on the outside with raw egg yolk in the hollowed center. The kids loved it. I bought a souvenir can of Spam after seeing Monty Python's Spam Lot in Broadway. It cost me $10 and is the most expensive Spam I have ever bought. I will never eat it. Thank you. Y'all are great dancers.
Yeah, thank you. Mahalo. Mahalo for the audience participation. That was great.
Everyone, I'm Lawrence. I want to start off by asking if we can have another round of applause. So thank you all for coming tonight and for participating and dancing. I couldn't see you from up front, but I'm assuming everybody was dancing. I want to remind you that Poets' books are on sale after the reading, and I know they would be happy to sign them for you, so I encourage you, if you don't already have them, to pick them up after the reading. I want to start actually the Q&A by reading something that Liz, you wrote in an interview with Craig. And you say, I think this is pure speculation on my part, that my interest in etymology came out of my linguistic experience while growing up in Hawaii. Multiple languages from across the globe intersect in Hawaii and within my own family. I grew up literally not understanding people I was told to identify as family. So the limited vocabulary we did share became that much more important. I believed if I could understand the origin of those unifying words, then I could learn something about my family that I could not get through conversation. So I wanted to start there, partly because the poem you read tonight spoke so much to different languages and to changing language, and then Brandy, your work, and thinking about kind of language revitalization and loss and preservation. And I wanted to open this up to the three of you. The formal linguistic play is in all of your poetry, and to talk a little bit about that play and your interest in language in relationship to place and culture and your particular politics.
You want me to start? Just toss me under the bus, man. Actually, first, I really want to thank my parents and my son are here, and they traveled with me from Hawaii. So I just want to give a shout out to them because I appreciate them coming with me. Okay, that was a long question. So in terms of like the etymology of language and thinking about it in terms of how it affects our poetics and our politics and that kind of thing. I think for myself, a lot of it is coming from this idea of frequently not understanding what is going on around me, both in terms of linguistically and culturally, of constantly trying to reinterpret so that it's something that I can gain access to, and maybe also sometimes understanding when I haven't earned the right to have access to something. And I will also say that as a spoken word artist, I think some of my interest in the language evolution also just comes from how those sounds play out when I'm performing, and how I can actually play with a word and spin it out as I'm writing a poem. I don't feel like that's a complete answer, but it's sort of scratching the surface.
Mahalo. Yeah, I think for me, of course, I mean, it shouldn't be this way, but using the Hawaiian language is a political act. And it's a political act because so much of indigenous identity, from what you wear to what school you send your child, to how you choose to educate your child, to your religion, every single part of your being it becomes politicized to a certain extent. And language, of course, is no different than that. As far as writing, I wrote, or I finished this book while I was still a student of Olala Hawaii, which is the Hawaiian language. And I was so enamored with learning the Hawaiian language and really kind of understanding a big part of my identity through it, and understanding who my ancestors were through that language, that I decided to not include a glossary in my book. So if you see in this book, I use quite a bit of Hawaiian language. I would still say that English is still the primary language throughout it, but when I use Hawaiian language, I do not translate it, sometimes not within the poem. There are other spaces in which you can maybe guess what I'm saying through context if you aren't familiar with the Hawaiian language. But I made a decision to not include a glossary. Part of that is because I wanted the book to be, to have some sort of measure of language sovereignty, of Hawaiian language sovereignty. And I felt that readers who really wanted to know could appreciate that and could support the Hawaiian language revitalization efforts. So I had a picture in my head of who my reader might be, and hopefully through the course of reading my book would want to kind of support those efforts and have a better understanding of the history of Hawaii and why language loss has been a part of the violence that has been inflicted throughout our history. It's actually an act of violence that we're still recovering from quite a bit today. I think right now, less than 10% of the Hawaiian population is able to speak the Hawaiian language. We're still recovering from it. For people who don't know, there was not a ban on the Hawaiian language, but there was a law that stated that English would be the only language used in schools and in government. So English became a language of power following the overthrow of Hawaii. And it functioned as a ban against the Hawaiian language. So when Hawaiian children went to school, they could be punished corporeally. They could be, often there are stories, a lot of stories about children getting slapped or hit with a stick for speaking Hawaiian. And that also that pain, that inflicted pain, lasted for generations afterwards. And again, we're still recovering from that.
Thank you for the question. And I would add too that Guam has a very similar history in terms of language colonialism, the displacement of our indigenous language by both the Spanish regime as well as the American and Japanese empires that colonized the island at different points. And what this did is it marginalized the language, suppressed it, punished people who spoke it, and our language is now classified as endangered. And majority of the people who speak it fluently are, above the age of 60, and so the last, first indigenous language generation is going to die out soon. And so what we're seeing now are a lot of efforts to revitalize the language through the arts, through education, just even through speaking it at home again for families that are able to. And language loss and revitalization is actually a major theme throughout Pacific poetry. A lot of writers talk about the kind of linguistic trauma that occurs, as well as the empowerment that happens when they begin to relearn the language. And actually, Brandy in her book has a beautiful poem about kind of relearning the language and then also relearning it with her grandfather, who was at least part of the Hawaiian generation in which the language was suppressed. And so there are a lot of inspiring stories out there, even though there's a long history of trauma around language. Yeah.
So I've been excited to learn over the last year or so, and I was lucky enough to visit all of you in Hawaii not that long ago.
Yeah.
And learning about a lot of the community organizing and the political organizing that you've been doing, and the central place of poetry in the work that you've been doing. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, both in particular, but then also kind of how, in a broader sense, how you see that or why you see poetry as such an important part of the organizing work that you do.
For Liz.
Hello again. Okay, so I'm I'm co-founder of Pacific Tongues, which is an organization that works in Hawaii and actually in other places in the Pacific as well with spoken word artists. And part of our mission is that we work a lot with youth. We actually started as Youth Speaks Hawaii, and we did a lot of work that was actually inspired by an organization called Youth Speaks, and that came out of the Bay Area in San Francisco. And they started a festival called Brave New Voices, which we were taking youth to for many, many years. And okay, so I'm just going to do a shout out for my kids for a little bit, because they won in the national competition in 2008 and 2009. Which was fun. But we've made a big step recently where we've actually decided not to take our youth to Brave New Voices anymore. And part of it was in talking to the youth and talking to them about the stories that they wanted to tell and that they wanted to hear, was that they actually really wanted to try to engage more in the Pacific. And a lot of our youth are of Kanaka Maoli background, of Filipino background, of other Pacific Islanders in terms of Tonga, Samoa. So they actually want to be able to tell a lot of those stories. And in participating in the national competition in Brave New Voices, some of the limitations that we were finding, that we were always having to tell the same story over and over again. So it was kind of like Hawaii 101, over and over and over again, which is actually within itself a really important practice. Like, I would say that every time that we participated in the organization or in that competition, about 400 youth went out into the world that knew more about Hawaii than they had known when they came in. But we also think it's really important because the activism that we do is about giving space for the youth that we work with to really speak their stories, to really be able to engage in the communities that they're in. And a lot of that is about them being able to speak the stories that are not Hawaii 101, but maybe about, the longer history. Like, one of the things that we find that happens in the Filipino stories is that it's always going back to the plantation. But actually the Filipino story, so the sugar plantations in terms of the immigration stories, but a lot of the Filipino history that is actually happening now is very different. Mm-hmm. So obviously this is a topic that I could talk about for a long time. But just to finish, I guess some of the other activism that we do within spoken word is just trying to bring attention to a lot of stories. Like, we've been doing work about West Papua, which is in the Papua New Guinea, or the New Guinea island. And we've been trying to bring attention to the atrocities that have been committed there with the Indonesian government. And one of the things that I think spoken word and poetry do that writing a whole bunch of articles can't ever really achieve is that poetry and spoken word really attack the heart. They really make people feel things. You know, it's like when you're performing, you can see people responding, see them responding emotionally. So a lot of times it gives them, I think, the incentive emotionally and the connection to actually be able to do something about the issues that we talk about. Sorry. Thank you.
No, I thought that was great. Yeah, it is worthy of applause. I think her whole comment. You know, and I think the work that Liz is doing with our youth in Hawaii is extremely inspirational. Something that inspires both of us every day. And a lot of what you were saying too about the role of poetry within social movements in Hawaii, I mean, is spot on. Poetry is often a feature for many issues. A couple recently, aside from the Free West Papua movement that we've been privileged to be a part of, is also the Protect Mauna Kea movement, which is happening right now too. And several others, where poetry is a feature of rallies. It's a feature of I think people getting together to try to process that kind of trauma and to process what is happening, and then also to kind of vocalize the emotion surrounding it, so that it creates a space for people then to move forward and strategize as to what can happen next. I think poetry is also an important intermediary in order to allow us to engage with a vision for a future that doesn't have to go these kinds of routes that degrade or destroy our environment, our aina, that don't destroy people, that don't privilege humans over animals and land and resources. So all of these things I think are important, and poetry is the prime way, I think, for us to kind of get through a lot of the issues that we're facing.
Yeah, definitely. Like thinking even about, contemporary Pacific poetry from the 1960s onward, so many of the major themes have been, decolonization, demilitarization, denuclearization, social injustice, language, colonialism, all of these issues speaking, are all political issues. And so what's exciting about studying Pacific poetry, reading it, is that you learn about all the different social movements and political movements that the poets are involved in. So, Hawaii and Guam, New Zealand, other places you go to political rallies, there's always poets there in addition to musicians and, speakers and stuff like that. You go to public hearings, whether they be about, urbanization or another military project, there are people who give their testimony in poetry. And poetry is good for that because sometimes you only get like 3 to 5 minutes to say your piece. One project that I've been doing in Hawaii is what I call the Poetry Feast. And it's kind of teaming up with different food sovereignty groups in Hawaii, but bringing in poetry. So having one project we did was with a food co-op in Honolulu. And basically we did a contest through the University of Hawaii where students, they submitted poems. I think the theme we did was like their favorite food or something. And we chose a winner, and then they got a gift certificate to the grocery store, and they got their poem put up at the grocery store too. And so I wanted to develop that further and team up with different, farms and Whole Foods. They're really into that kind of stuff. And then, winning poems will get like, gift certificate to the store. So poetry can feed you in some ways, and it also raises awareness about different food sovereignty issues. And, it definitely kind of feeds into kind of the creative, nonviolent, activist trends that are happening now, in the U.S. and across Pacific, in Europe, and where art is becoming that way to speak to the heart, to be creative, to express yourself, and really to be that kind of powerful kind of spears of words, or the weapons for the weak. Think about how other people have kind of conceptualized poetry. But yeah, it's powerful, and we definitely believe in poetry's ability to heal us and to empower us.
So I think we'd like to turn things over to the audience for questions.
If I may, I must say, I'm from the Caribbean. So I'm from, and when I was at USC Film School in LA, one of my best friends was from Hawaii. I'm trying to remember which island she was from. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
It's okay.
But she was from Hawaii, and we would continually talk about, and what was so interesting in our conversations is like, that shit is happening by you too.
Yeah.
Jesus over here, the same thing, and back and forth and stuff like that. So, what I'd like to ask is a few questions. You talk a lot, obviously, about the military and colonial context that Hawaii is undergoing, and what I really like in your poem is your attempt, obviously, to try to emphasize the cultural and socioeconomic political integrity of Hawaii, right, or try to revitalize it. But it's a very difficult situation at this point in time, right, with the tremendous emphasis that and control that the United States has over that situation. I mean, the same thing in Puerto Rico, etc. Now in Cuba to come. You didn't talk too much about tourism, right, and the effects of tourism. I mean, if you want to see one of the places that tourism has had a catastrophic effect, come to my small island of St. Martin, right, which is literally one of the prettiest places. I don't want to say that. I'm sure you can say the same, but one of the prettiest places in the world. I mean, really beautiful island. Basically, being prostituted to death, destroyed, built over, etc., etc. So, what is one of the issues of dealing with tourism, and how you guys see that? And another one is, are you guys trying to reach any kind of, you talk about the attempt to reach out to other Asian Pacific people. Are you trying to reach out to people in the Caribbean, people in the Indian Ocean, people in other parts on islands I'm talking about, right? Is this worldwide island solidarity against this colonialism, linguistic and cultural, we all see this cultural tremendous alienation of our people, this contempt of their own language, oh Jesus, you're speaking a monkey English, what the hell are you speaking, The only good language is obviously American English, or even better than American English, because that's kind of a barking dog English that's in the Caribbean, is English, right?
Right.
But the issue is, are you guys reaching out? And also another issue, the poetry. What effects has, for example, African American poetry have on you guys? Latino poetry, Caribbean poetry, and Latin American poetry. Is there a lot of discussion, for example, in your universities about these type of things, and seeing all of these, these synthesis that is taking place across the world?
Well, okay. I can start with the tourism part of it. As many of you know, Hawaii is also a place, and that has been very overly touricized. I'm going to just make that a word. Overly touricized. And in particular, places like Waikiki were completely changed. I mean, Waikiki was actually marshlands before, they had sand brought over, and everything was completely sort of changed in order to create the Waikiki that people see now, which is, flooded with hotels. There's a canal there that now is largely kind of stagnant water that people can't swim in and everything. And that was actually the water that was a part of the marshlands. They had to figure out how to do that, so they created a canal. All of this energy and resources went into building kind of a monstrosity of tourism that we now know as Waikiki, that has completely sort of changed the landscape. And as we know from climate change projections, all of that is going to go into the ocean once the ocean rises, because water has a long memory and it remembers where it was supposed to be. So we think about kind of the violence against our land through tourism. you know, I think there are a couple of interesting movements with regard to tourism in Hawaii. Often people are kind of split into whether or not there are elements of the tourism industry that can be saved or made more Hawaiianized, if that makes sense, made more respectful, made more open to indigenous Hawaiian knowledge, and have that be a part of a tourist experience. Ecotourism, there's also cultural tourism. And then there are other people who are completely against all of that too, because there are difficulties. You can't really completely escape the exploitation that comes with tourism either, even if you try to find a environmentally friendly or culturally sensitive kind of route. So people are kind of divided on that particular issue. I kind of go both ways. I want to see some sort of hope or some sort of way in which we could think about, you know, the original hospitality, the ho'okipa of our people, which has always been there, which continues to be exploited for tourism. You know, it's a real thing. Aloha is real. Our ho'okipa, our hospitality is real. It's just been taken advantage of for a very long time. And how do we still retain that part of ourselves, yet still kind of stand up for our land and stand up for our people? So that's the crossroads we're at now as far as that issue goes.
Yeah, there's a great book called Roots and Routes by Elizabeth DeLaffrey, and it's kind of a comparative look at Pacific Islander and Caribbean literature, like island literature basically. And so that's a great book because there's a lot of similar themes, you know, as you mentioned, tourism being one of them. And actually both African and African American literature have had an indelible mark on Pacific literature. A lot of the early work from the 60s and 70s, like out of the University of Papua New Guinea, a lot of those writers were studying decolonial third world African literature and later African American civil rights literature. And actually one of our colleagues at the University of Hawaii, Paul Lyons, taught a course on Pacific Islander and African American literature. And there's a lot of, I think, exciting comparisons that you can make in terms of, you know, social justice, civil rights, decolonial rights, indigenous rights. Actually, Brandon and I performed, we were in Puerto Rico a couple years ago, and we got to perform one of my good friends, Udayoan Noel, who's one of my favorite Puerto Rican poets. And what's funny, like when we first met, it's like, he looked like my cousin. Maybe a little bit more different from Hawaii, because Guam, we have a Spanish colonial history too. And so Guam and Puerto Rico, I think, have a lot in common in terms of that history, in terms of, you know, Catholicism as well. And, you know, talking with him, he just wrote a book on Puerto Rican poetry. And there's a lot of interesting, I think, similarities too.
I don't actually really feel like I have that much to add to what Craig and Brandy were saying. I think like they said, in terms of the Pacific literature connections, there's definitely a lot of that happening, and particularly happened in the past. I don't know that you can say that there's as much happening now. If you know someone, just let me know. We can see about making that kind of connection. And I will say that I think that all of us probably have personally been really influenced by African American poets in particular. I mean, the first poet that I can remember reading and seeing perform who really, really moved me when I was 18 years old was Sonia Sanchez. And she was one of the first people that made me believe that I could actually be a part of poetry. So I think that, and I try to pass that on to my students and to my youth. So in that way, there are those continued connections. But, and again, and similar experiences to what you described as far as when I've met friends from the Caribbean of being like, oh, there's all these common stories and common trends. But yeah, we can always build more. Thank you. I'm always trying to get rid of it.
Nervous, the voice is going to shake. I want to say thank you for being here. I actually saw you guys at UH
That's right.
I moved here at the end of December. Something that I was very frustrated with before I left was what I kind of felt was a sort of apathy towards the Black Lives Matter movement, which I was happy to hear you mention that in your poetry. What do you think is the importance of recognizing anti-Blackness in its relation to not even just Hawaiians but also Filipinos, and how do you suggest kind of making those connections? Because there's also like obviously a very heavy influence, especially amongst our generation, from Black culture, and there is an appropriation of Black culture in Hawaii, and this kind of feeling that, oh, I'm brown, so I can say certain things, or I can kind of use language that maybe we shouldn't be using. How do we engage in conversations with Hawaiians to make that connection to anti-Blackness and draw the roots of what we're experiencing as Hawaiians to what is ultimately driven by anti-Blackness?
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue. It's hard because I think I have a student who's been working on, he identifies himself as a settler in Hawaii and is really interested in looking at settler colonialism. And he has this term that he's been using, and it's called the slipperiness of empathy, right? I think a typical answer might be to say, we need to kind of think about our own historical injustices, right? And try to empathize. But it doesn't always work so easily. It doesn't, this experience A doesn't necessarily translate into understanding what experience B was like, right? And so part of it would have to be empathy, yes, but also really trying to educate ourselves and try to kind of open up communication, I think, about it. I think that's what's really important. Like everywhere else within the lands now known as the United States, people end up looking at particular issues happening across these lands through a filter of American media. And often that has a very skewed sort of view, or it has a one-dimensional view of what that issue is. So when we think of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's always through that filter, I think. I think we need to try to open up discussion so that we can kind of break down that filter and really discuss how what's at stake here is people are being completely dehumanized, and violence is happening because they've been completely dehumanized, and that we can't stand for that. Violence to one, it is like what Dr. Martin Luther King says, violence to one is violence to us all. And we need to really own that idea and open up discussion about that. What does it mean? How are we all impacted by the violence that is happening against Black people, and in particular Black men? How does that affect us all? I think we can all kind of understand what violence is, and we need to empathize, but again, we also need to try to open up communications to understand how we can't completely empathize either. We need to kind of own that violence happens.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think, for me, poetry has a way of articulating connections that we don't always see in everyday life. And so that poem I read was, just like Brandy mentioned, trying to make connections, different kinds of violences to different peoples, mainly peoples of color. So thinking about, Free Palestine, Black Lives Matter, unaccompanied in terms of, migrants from Central South America escaping violence in their homelands. as well as, justice for Colin Elders, who was a young Hawaiian man that was murdered by a federal agent in Hawaii. Connecting that to the violence in West Papua that Liz mentioned earlier. These are all, sometimes racial, sometimes state violence, sometimes military violence, sometimes violence caused by capitalism. And so trying to make those connections so that we can see that there are these moments where we can have solidarity and form alliances. I think what's really exciting about the moment we're living in is these connections are being articulated a lot through social media, so that's also the idea of the hashtag, yeah? Where a topic like climate change, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, everybody is affected by it. And so we can think about how we are differently affected and how those affects have kind of racial dimensions as well. And so I think that's what I'm trying to do with some of those poems, is to think about how we're all connected in different ways and how those connections are then inflected by our own subjectivities.
Yes, thank you for your question. It was interesting that you were talking about it in terms of the connections between Black lives, and then also saying Filipino, Kanakamole. So I think my experience has also been a little different from yours in terms of the youth that I've had the privilege of working with. So we're actually in the process right now with Pacific Tongues of getting a full-length show together with 4 young women, and of the 4 young women, 3 of them are half Black and half Filipino. And so one of the overarching themes of the show that we've started with is sacred spaces. And it was interesting because what first came up within that was the movement that is kind of part of Black Lives Matter, but is Say Her Name. And they knew, they were instantly activated by that and started writing poetry about it that I'm fairly certain is going to wind up being part of that show. So I think that's one of the ways that, and of course I'm going to advocate for that because I'm a spoken word artist, so I'm totally biased. But that's one of the ways that, that we can have those kinds of conversations and performing those stories. And one of the things that they've actually started doing is telling the stories as much as they possibly can of some of the names of Black women who have been ignored.
Sorry, I just want to add to that Black women are biggest victims of that violence, and it's not shown.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I'm always trying to get rid of this.
I think that's a good place to stop. Thanks so much to our readers and to Lawrence for moderating this discussion. As Lawrence did say, we have books by all 3 poets in the back. Please do get them signed, buy them, get them signed at the table right over there. Congratulate our readers, and thanks to you for coming out.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.